Right now, without moving from where you are sitting, you are almost certainly closer to more people than most humans who ever lived met in their entire lifetimes. You do not know their names. You are never going to know their names. You will share a wall with some of them, and a street, and a water supply, and a power grid, and a set of laws, and you will do it for years, and at no point today will it strike you as strange. It should. 9,000 years ago, on a plain in what is now central Turkey, several thousand people were already doing it, in a town called Çatalhöyük. It had no streets. There was nowhere for a front door to face, so you got into your house through a hole in the roof, down a ladder, next to the oven. To visit anybody, you walked across the top of the town. They were among the first people on Earth to live packed together like that. And the archaeology is fairly blunt about what it did to them. They got shorter, they got sicker, their teeth fell apart, and they buried a lot more of their children. That is not a slow decline over thousands of years. It shows up in the bones, in the first few generations, in almost every part of the world where people stopped moving and started stacking up. So here's the question this video is actually about. Not how we built cities. We know how you build a city. You cut stone and you stack it. The question is why anybody stayed. We are going to walk it forwards in order from the first people who settled down to the street you are sitting on, a hill in southern Turkey, the oldest wall on Earth, a town with no streets, the moment somebody first wrote something down, which was not a poem, and a stretch of 300 years when the average city still could not keep its own population alive. Start with what you would have been giving up. For roughly 200,000 years, the standard human arrangement was a band. 20 people, maybe 50. Everyone in it was someone you knew personally. You knew their voice from the next tent. You knew who was reliable in a crisis and who was not, because you had watched them your whole life. You ate an enormous range of things, dozens of plant species across a year, whatever came within range. When one food failed, you moved, or you switched, and the fact that you were not committed to any single crop is exactly what made a bad year survivable. You owned what you could carry. That last one sounds like poverty. It is worth sitting with, because it is the most important thing you are about to lose. If everything you own moves with you, then nobody can take it while you sleep. Nobody can count it. Nobody can tax it. There is no store to raid, no field to burn, no granary to seize. And if the person telling you what to do becomes intolerable, you can simply walk away from them and keep walking, and there is nothing they can do about it. Mobility is not just a way of finding food. It is the thing that makes tyranny difficult. So the question is, what could possibly have been worth giving that up? And the honest answer is that the first people to give it up do not seem to have decided anything at all. Go to southeastern Turkey to a low hill called Göbekli Tepe. People were building there in stone around 9,500 years before the Common Era. It was excavated from the mid-1990s by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, who worked the site until his death in 2014. Not huts. Enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them 5 meters tall and weighing several tons, set in rings, carved with foxes and boars and scorpions and vultures and snakes, quarried, shaped, moved and raised by people who had not domesticated their food. When this was first excavated, the interpretation was spectacular, and you have probably heard some version of it. No houses had been found. No water source had been found. So the site was interpreted as a pure sanctuary, a temple on a hill built by hunter-gatherers who traveled there, gathered in numbers, and had to be fed while they worked. And if you have to feed a crowd like that, foraging will not do it, so somebody starts cultivating, which meant the textbook order was upside down. Not farming, then surplus, then settlement, then temples. Temples first, and farming invented to pay for them. It is a wonderful story, and the people digging the site have since walked it back. More recent excavation has found what the early work did not: evidence of domestic activity. Non-monumental buildings that look like ordinary houses. Cisterns cut for water. Signs of people living there permanently from the late 10th millennium before the Common Era, with the ordinary buildings and the monumental ones standing at the same time. The reading now from the excavation itself is not a temple where nobody lived. It is a settlement with a very pronounced ritual side. And that revision makes the story better rather than worse, because the claim we actually need is the simpler one underneath it. People were living in one place, permanently, at scale, building in stone that takes hundreds of coordinated workers to move, and they were doing all of it before they had domesticated their crops. Permanent settlement did not wait for agriculture. It arrived first. We did not farm our way into settling down. We settled down at a size that should not have been possible and worked out the food afterwards, which creates the next problem, and you can watch them solve it about 1,500 years later, 500 kilometers to the south. At Tel es Sultan, the mound of ancient Jericho in the Jordan Valley, the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated through the 1950s and found something nobody expected at that date. A stone wall around the settlement and set into it a solid stone tower around 8 meters high with an internal staircase built around 8,000 years before the Common Era. That is thousands of years before writing, before the wheel, before metal tools of any use. People with none of those things quarried, moved, and stacked stone on that scale around a settlement and cut a staircase up through the middle of it. And there is a real argument about why. The obvious reading is defense, and for a long time that was the assumption. But the archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef pointed out there is very little evidence of warfare at Jericho at that date and proposed the wall may have been built against flooding and mud flows coming off the slope above, with the tower serving some other communal or ritual purpose entirely. Both readings tell you the same thing, which is why the argument does not need settling here. Whether they were keeping out water or keeping out people, several hundred people coordinated an enormous construction project for years to protect a place they had decided not to leave. That is the moment the exit starts closing. Not because anyone was stopped from walking away, but because they had built something too heavy to carry. Another 1,000 years on, in central Anatolia, you get the next stage, and it looks nothing like a city. Çatalhöyük from roughly 7,100 years before the Common Era. Excavated by James Mellert in the 1960s, and again far more carefully by Ian Hodder from the 1990s. At its height, several thousand people, which at that date makes it one of the largest gatherings of humans anywhere on Earth. It has no streets. That is not a detail. Try to picture the place properly. The houses are packed directly against one another, wall sharing wall, with no gaps between them and no lanes running through. There is no front door because there is nowhere for a front door to face. You get into your house through a hole in the roof, down a ladder, next to the oven, which means the surface of the settlement, the public space, the thing that does the job a street does, is the roofs. You walk across the top of the town. You cross other people's ceilings to get home. And then the part that matters most. There is no palace, no identified temple district set apart from ordinary life, no obvious administrative quarter. The houses are broadly similar in size, and the more elaborately decorated ones are not clustered into a rich neighborhood. The dead are buried under the floors of the houses, which means they stay in the home rather than in a monument to somebody important. So here are several thousand people, living at genuine urban density, for well over 1,000 years, apparently without kings, without a priestly class holding its own district, and without the visible inequality we assume a settlement that size requires. Density came first. Hierarchy came later, and it was not inevitable. It was a thing that had to be built. But something else was happening in those houses, and it was not optional at all. In 1984, two anthropologists, Mark Nathan Cohen and George Armalagos, pulled together skeletal studies from across the world into one volume, comparing populations from just before farming with populations from just after it in the same regions. It is called Paleopathology at the Origins of Agriculture, and it is still the reference point for this argument. When you compare skeletons from early farming settlements with skeletons from the foraging populations living near them at the same time, the pattern comes out consistent enough to be uncomfortable. Adult height drops. In some regions, the average settled adult ends up several centimeters shorter than their foraging neighbors, which is a rough proxy for how well fed a person was while they were growing. The teeth get much worse. A diet built on one starchy staple, ground on stone querns, is a diet full of sugar and grit. Cavities appear at rates foragers simply do not show. Enamel develops defects, which happen when a child is malnourished or seriously ill during the years that tooth is forming, and those defects are permanent. You can see a bad childhood in an adult tooth thousands of years later. Iron deficiency shows up in the skull, infection markers show up on the long bones, infant mortality climbs. So settling down was not an upgrade in quality of life. For the average person doing it, on the evidence in their own skeleton, it was a downgrade. Then it gets worse because density does something a village of 40 people cannot do. Almost every infectious disease that has seriously shaped human history needs a crowd to exist at all. Measles is the clean example. It burns through a person in about a fortnight, and then they are immune for life. which means it needs a constant supply of people who have never had it. Drop the population below a certain size, and the disease runs out of hosts and dies out. A band of 40 cannot sustain measles. Neither, as it happens, can a town of 10,000. The statistician Maurice Bartlett worked the threshold out in 1957, comparing outbreak patterns against the size of the communities they ran through, and the number is around 250,000 people. Below that, measles burns out and stays out until somebody carries it back in from outside, which means measles is not an early city disease at all. It is a disease that had to wait several thousand years for us to build something big enough to hold it. The first settlements got sick a different way. Add livestock living in the same space, and you get a pipeline for diseases that used to be an animal problem and are now yours. Add stored grain, and you get rodents and everything rodents carry. Add hundreds of people drawing from the same water, and you get the entire family of illnesses that spread through it. Foragers were not disease-free. They had parasites and injuries and infections. What they did not have was epidemics, because an epidemic is a thing that requires an audience. And they stayed anyway, for 4,000 more years. Which brings us to the place where somebody finally worked out how to run a settlement that had outgrown everyone in it. Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. By around 3,100 years before the Common Era, it holds tens of thousands of people, monumental architecture, and a hinterland of villages feeding it. In 1950, the archaeologist Veer Gordon Child wrote an essay trying to pin down what actually separates a city from a large village. His answer was not size. It was full-time specialists, a surplus that somebody collects, monumental building, writing, and a class of people who do not grow their own food. Uruk is where every item on that list turns up at once, and it is worth being clear about what that buys, because this is the first honest answer to why anybody stayed. Put tens of thousands of people in one place and something becomes possible that 40 people can never manage. You can afford somebody who does nothing but make pots, and somebody who does nothing but work metal, and somebody who does nothing but keep records, and each of them gets better at their one thing than any generalist ever could. You can dig irrigation that takes 400 people in 2 years, and then farm land that was useless before. You can hold enough grain to survive a failed harvest that would have scattered a band. You can put a wall up and keep it manned. None of that makes the average resident healthier. Every skeleton we just looked at still says the opposite, but all of it makes the settlement harder to destroy. And that is the uncomfortable shape of the whole thing. A city does not have to be good for you to win. It only has to outlast its neighbors. A place with walls, a grain store, specialists and numbers will outlast a band of 40 every single time, regardless of how miserable it is to live there. The people inside it are not being rewarded. They are being used by something that survives better than they do. There is a second cost that arrives here too, and it is the one you are still paying and cannot feel. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist at Oxford, is known for an argument about group size. Comparing brain structure across primates against the size of the groups they live in, he proposed that humans have a natural ceiling on the number of people we can hold as genuine relationships. The figure usually attached to it is around 150. Treat the exact number carefully, because it is a contested estimate rather than a measured constant. But the shape of the claim is not really in doubt. There is a ceiling, and Uruk is enormously above it. In a band, behavior is governed by the fact that everyone knows everyone. You do not steal because the person you stole from will know it was you, and so will everybody else for the rest of your life. Reputation is the entire enforcement system, and it costs nothing to run. Put tens of thousands of people together, and that system collapses. The person you cheat is someone you will never see again. Reputation stops working because there is no shared audience to carry it, so you have to build something to replace it. Written rules, judges, weights and measures somebody guarantees, punishments carried out by people with no personal stake, and that is exactly what Uruk produces. Not poetry, not scripture, not the deeds of kings. The earliest tablets are accounts. Counts of grain, counts of sheep, counts of jars and workers and days of labor and who delivered what to whom. Signs for the commodity, signs for the number, pressed into wet clay with a cut reed and left to dry in the sun. The scholar Denise Schmont-Besserat traced the system back further still, to small clay tokens used across the Near East for thousands of years to stand for goods. One token for one measure. Writing does not begin as an idea. It begins as a way of not losing count. Humans invented writing to do inventory. The very first thing our species chose to make permanent out of everything available to say was a receipt. And you do not need a receipt in a band of 40. You do not write down what your brother-in-law owes you. You remember it, and so does he, and so does everybody else, and that is enough. You need a receipt when there are more people than any one person can keep track of, when the grain is in a central store, and when somebody has the authority to work out what is owed, which is where the trap finally closes. And it closes on grain specifically. Think about what you can actually tax. You cannot tax a forager. Their food is spread across a landscape, it ripens at different times, half of it is perishable, and if you turn up demanding a share, they will simply be somewhere else next week. Now look at wheat and barley. They ripen at a predictable time. They all ripen at roughly the same time. They have to be harvested in a narrow window in a known place, and then they sit in a store, in one spot, in countable units, for months. A crop like that is not just food. It is an accessible asset that cannot run away. The anthropologist James Scott made this argument at length in a book called Against the Grain, published in 2017. And the core of it is that the earliest states did not appear wherever people were most comfortable. They appeared wherever the food was most legible, where it could be seen, measured, stored, and therefore taken. Land gets owned. Debt appears. And debt is a very effective wall, because a person who owes cannot simply walk, and plenty of them still did. Early states collapsed constantly. Populations vanish from the record and turn up dispersed across the countryside. Settlements are abandoned, sometimes for centuries. For a long time, this was written up as tragedy, as civilizations falling, as dark ages descending. Some of it was disaster, plainly. But a good deal of it looks like people examining the deal, deciding it was not worth it, and returning to a life that was measurably healthier, which tells you the trap was never total. It was just, on average, tightening. And here is the part that rules out coincidence. It did not happen once. Cities appear independently in at least 5 places that had no contact with each other. Mesopotamia, at Uruk, the Indus Valley, at Harappa, and Mohenjo-Daro, where by 2,600 years before the Common Era, there are tens of thousands of people, streets on a grid, baked bricks made to standard proportions across an area the size of a country, and covered drains running under the streets. The Yellow River in China, Mesoamerica. And on the coast of Peru, at Corral, excavated from the 1990s by the archaeologist Ruth Shady, where monumental platforms and sunken plazas were going up in the same centuries, in a society that has left remarkably little evidence of warfare. Different continents, different crops, different gods. Same outcome. When something happens once, it might be an accident. When it happens 5 times, in 5 places, with no communication between them, it is not an accident. It is what happens when you take a species that evolved in groups of 40 and give it a food supply that sits still and can be counted. And now jump forward 8,000 years, because the strangest number in this story is not ancient at all. For most of recorded history, cities did not produce enough children to replace the people dying in them. Deaths outran births. The gap was made up entirely by people arriving from the countryside. This is best measured in early modern Europe, where the parish registers are good enough to count properly, and there the arithmetic is stark across the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Historians call it the urban graveyard effect. A large city of that era was not growing because it was thriving. It was growing because the villages around it kept sending replacements faster than it could bury them. Sit with what that means. 8,000 years after Jericho, a city was still a thing that consumed people. It ran a permanent deficit of human beings and stayed alive by importing more. And they kept coming. That is the detail that finishes the argument. Nobody was marching them in. There was no wall keeping them there. Every single one of those arrivals was a person who looked at a village where they would probably live longer and walked towards a city where they probably would not. They were not wrong to. The city had the work, and the trade, and the specialists, and the only route out of a life that had already been decided for them. It just also had the cholera. That is the bargain in its clearest form, and it survived for 8,000 years without either half of it ever being written down or agreed to. So how did humans invent cities? Not by deciding to. Nobody looked at a band of 40 healthy people and designed this. The people who took the first steps got shorter, sicker, and poorer for it, and their own skeletons say so. We got here because permanent settlement turned out to be possible before anyone could farm properly. Because the people who settled built things too heavy to walk away from. Because feeding a crowd that size meant committing to crops that happened to be countable and storable and therefore takeable. Because once a thing can be taken, somebody eventually takes it, and once your food is in their store and your name is in their ledger, leaving stops being simple. And because we outgrew the group size where knowing each other was enough and had to invent law to replace it. Cities did not win because they were good for people. They won because they were hard to leave and harder to beat. And you are still living in the deal. You still eat a narrow range of things that somebody else grows in a place you have never been. You still keep almost none of what you would need to feed yourself for a single season. You still live among people whose names you do not know, protected by rules you did not agree to and could not personally enforce, in a settlement you could not walk out of and survive in the way a forager could. What you got in exchange is everyone else. Every specialist. Every skill too narrow for anyone to bother learning in a group of 40. Every job that only makes sense because there are a million people nearby who need it done. The surgeon, the electrician, the person who does nothing all day but tune one instrument. None of them can exist in a band. All of them exist because you are surrounded. The bargain has not changed since the rooftops of Çatalhöyük. Density. In exchange for everything density makes possible. We just stopped noticing we had made it.